The Connecticut Asylum for the Education and Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons was the very first deaf school in America and helped revolutionize alternative methods of communication between deaf and hearing using certain teaching methods, and welcomed deaf and hearing of all ages and origins to the school. The school and its teachers worked hard to teach the unteachable life lessons and knowledge that would be critical for everyday life, and a better and more organized way to communicate for the deaf, and influenced many other deaf schools to start up. Lawrence Clerk, Thomas H. Gallaudet, and Dr. Mason Cogswell were the three revolutionary men that started the first permanent school in America, specifically started for educating the deaf when other schools could not. In the 1800s, there was very little hope for the disabled and were often cast off and thought unteachable, resulting in countless deaf and mutes having no education or language. This story starts off with Thomas Gallaudet, who went to Yale University at the age of 14 and graduated within 3 years at the top of his class. He lived in Connecticut next to his neighbor, Dr. Mason Cogswell. They both had their sense of hearing, but had developed compassion for the deaf community because Mason's daughter, Alice, was a deaf mute who had no education and no language to communicate with. When Thomas had met Alice, he knew she was deaf, and he tried to communicate with her by showing her his hat and writing "hat" in the dirt. He was moved by the compassion and thirst for knowledge in Alice, and wanted to help other deaf and mute people to still get an education, despite them being unteachable. And Dr. Mason was concerned with his daughter's education level and the lack of it. Dr. Mason had a sign language book that was from a French deaf school, and he wanted Thomas to try to teach Alice some signs. And Thomas did. He and Alice learned the French manual alphabet, and they were making so much progress. But just that little book wasn't going to properly or fully educate anybody. So Dr. Mason Cogswell, being the powerful man he was, consulted with the other rich people of the community to try to raise funds to send Thomas to Europe to further study the methods for educating the deaf. And after a lot of thought, everyone agreed to send Thomas to Europe because there were so many deaf children in need of an education in America. Thomas arrived in Liverpool, England on June 25, 1815, and had made his way to a deaf school in Brighton, England, where he met Abbé Sicard, Jean Massieu, and Laurent Clerc. Laurent became deaf from an accident as an infant, and was lucky enough to be able to attend a deaf school in France. But due to a traumatic experience with a teacher punching him because he couldn't pronounce a syllable right, Laurent vowed he would never learn how to use verbal speech. Instead, he learned sign language and figured out that the best method for a deaf or mute person to learn is with motor movements, by using sign language, rather than verbal speech. Thomas was welcomed to the school by the three men and became immediate friends with them. Abbé Sicard suggested he go to a deaf school in France that Laurent Clerc would be teaching at, so he could further study signing, methods, and the art of deaf education. So Thomas went to the Institut Royal des Sourds Muets, Paris, France, where he studied techniques and signing for nearly 3 months. But he realized it would be extremely difficult to bring back all this information by himself. Thomas was trying to absorb as much information as possible, but it soon became overwhelming. Thomas then decided to ask Laurent Clerc if he would come back with him to America to help him establish a deaf school and be a teacher. Laurent was intrigued, but hesitant. Laurent thought it was a good idea to spread his knowledge of sign language with the world, but the decision was ultimately up to Laurent's superior, Abbé Sicard. So Thomas sent Abbé a letter asking for his permission, and after a lot of contemplation and consideration, Abbé agreed to let Laurent teach in America. So Laurent Clerc and Thomas Gallaudet had embarked on a 52-day ship trip on the Mary Augusta from Europe to America on June 18, 1816. During their sail to America, Thomas taught Laurent English writing, and Laurent taught Thomas more sign language. They were exchanging knowledge and became close friends. Now, Clerc, Gallaudet, and Cogswell all met up in Connecticut and started planning how they were going to start a school. The three men were able to start the school fairly quickly because Laurent and Thomas raised funds for their future school back in Europe, and Cogswell raised funds in Connecticut. They found a building, set up classrooms, prepared sleeping quarters, and went around to families with deaf children to inform them about the new school they were opening soon. The news of this new school spread fast. Laurent trained new teachers, and Dr. Cogswell was very involved in the board and continued to fundraise for the school, and Thomas became the very first principal of the school. And finally, the Connecticut Asylum for the Education and Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb, now known as the American School for the Deaf, was founded in Hartford, Connecticut on April 15, 1817. With the school only starting out with 7 students, including Alice Cogswell, the school was a great success and continued to grow. The American School for the Deaf is still around and open today, and is often referred to as the mother school for deaf schools in America because it influenced and motivated many other deaf schools to start up around the country, spreading education and sign language to countless adults and children, deaf and hearing. This school was very successful and in many ways could be considered ahead of its time. For example, they welcomed both male and female students, hearing or deaf, of all ages to their school. This school also taught sign language rather than verbal because it is the best method for a deaf student to learn, and they had their best interests at heart. Laurent Clerc and Thomas Gallaudet worked together to create what is known today as ASL, American Sign Language, with French and English native signs mixed together to make a sign language that is the most used in America. Laurent Clerc, Mason Cogswell, and Thomas Gallaudet changed the deaf and mute norm from unteachable and useless to productive and influential. Without these 3 men coming together to create a school for the deaf in America, countless deaf and mutes would still have no education and no language. But because they had compassion and determination, so many people's lives were and are made fuller and more vibrant with the blessing of communication. Modern ASL wouldn't be what it is today without these 3 men taking initiative and deciding to help deaf and mutes in need. And ASL is deeply rooted from LSF, French Sign Language. So without the deaf schools in France that taught signing, and the kind teachers and leaders that shared their knowledge, deaf education could be very different in the US. ASL is not the only sign language out there though. As you know, there is LSF, but there are also native sign languages for almost all other languages and countries, like ISL, Irish Sign Language, SSL, Spanish Sign Language, CSL, Chinese Sign Language, and many more. But even though there are different signs for different languages around the world, they all have something in common. Someone, somewhere, at some point, had to have the passion and determination to help the deaf people of the world, to have a form of communication and a chance at education, no matter the view of deaf people at the time. But even though deaf and mute people were thought unteachable and were often pushed to the side and not paid attention to, the 3 founders still found the capacity in their hearts for love and acceptance for these people in need. For one reason or another, whether they were deaf themselves or they wanted to just help that community, these 3 men were truly revolutionary. It's pretty incredible to see just how far deaf education has come.